Greenspan. All right, now you may say, why is he on there? Was the Fed involved with this? And the answer is no, he wasn't at the Fed yet. He was at a consulting firm, Townsend and Greenspan, which is what he was doing before he joined the Fed. And he opined on the impact of cassette tapes. And what he says is that the property rights of copyright owners is going to get damaged, and the industry sounds very bad. It has no out unless something meaningful is done. The industry itself is at risk. This was probably more reasonable than the VCR argument. People had it at their homes. They could make cassettes when they weren't listening to music, and then they could listen to the music somewhere else. So some of the constraints that the VCR had wouldn't hold. But there was always a question of whether or not it was damaging the industry. And indirect appropriability sort of comes in here as well. If you make a cassette for your car, because let's say you have an LP. You can't play an LP in your car. It's one of the big problems with LPs. They were these big things. And cassettes come along, and one of the things cassettes allow you to do is to play music in your car. So you purchase the LP, you make a copy cassette unauthorized, but then you put it in your car. That raises the value that you place on the LP. Okay, because now when you purchase the LP, you don't just get the value from listening to the LP in your living room, you also have the value of listening to the cassette, which is enabled by the LP. So you might have indirect appropriability going on to some extent, and that might allow the recording industry to generate some of the revenues from those uses. And cassettes, when you make a copy of a copy of a copy, very quickly go down in quality. And so that was going to restrict how many copies you can make generationally, and you generally had to know people. You had to actually physically exchange the cassettes or the LPs or something. So it wasn't going to necessarily be big, but it seemed like it might have a negative impact. I was willing to believe that it might on this case. Greenspan's statement, however, was bad timing. He testified, and I'll show you in a few minutes, after 4 years or so of industry decline, when it looked like things were going bad. Right after he testifies, industry revenues start going up, and things look great, and it just doesn't seem what he says makes much sense at that point, because they started, sound recordings had a long expansion after this, and so I think people said it's not a serious problem.
So Greenspan was always weak on business cycles.
It wasn't a business cycle issue, even though it was the end of a business cycle. He should have known, because I think the quote was 82 or 83, and so it was the end. Okay. So I'm going in the opposite direction, hitting the wrong button. It's a brand new pointer. All right, that brings us to MP3s. And I started writing about this when MP3s came out, and I was familiar with the other three. I'd written about photocopying. I had written slightly about cassettes, and I had written an unpublished piece about the video recorder. So I figured I should write about this as well. Since there was only a teeny little group of people that ever paid attention to these, I didn't want to lose my position there. And I wrote a paper which said that this time it would cause a problem. All right, because the economics was set up in such a way that the factors that kept the other type of technologies from really causing harm weren't going to come into play. All right, and in this talk, I'm going to claim it is causing major damage. All right, there's the wolf. Not the one that we saw in the second slide, but a more serious, friendlier wolf. And so, before I get into discussing what economists have done, I want to discuss something that I wouldn't really feel comfortable saying necessarily in front of too many economists, because I would be accused of heresy. And that is to say that sometimes methodology that we use to try to answer scientific questions doesn't have to be what we normally learn in textbooks. Okay, and one of the keys is whether or not what we're measuring is big enough. Okay, it makes a big difference when you're talking about cause and effect. If these are really big causes and really big effects, it's much easier to measure than if they're small. All right, so no one has to do a controlled test to see whether or not arsenic kills people. Okay, because you take a little and you're dead. We don't have to have two control groups. one group gets a placebo, and one group gets arsenic, and we see if the group with the arsenic dies and the group with the placebo doesn't. All right? We know that just from looking at arsenic has such a big effect, it shows it to us right away. No real need for normal scientific methods, because there's nothing else going on that could explain people dropping dead very quickly after taking the substance. Okay, and of course it's size, but it's sort of also quickly, how fast it happens. And so what I'm basically saying is the bigger the cause, then if there is a relationship, the bigger the effect. And if you actually have a really big cause and a really big effect that tend to happen at the same time, that's going to provide a lot of information that tells us that, in fact, there's a relationship which may be causal. All right, there may be something, a third factor causing both of them, but they're likely to be related. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. And this is supposed to be Ben Franklin. All right, now, of course, it's not really a picture of Ben Franklin, but I think it's someone dressed up as Ben Franklin. And you, of course, recognize he's conducting his electricity experiment, and he's got a kite, and he's got, on there, he's got his keys, which are going to conduct the electricity, and Franklin was something of a scientist. And more than we necessarily give him credit for. And he was quite good. And for a while, he lived in England, and he came up with a hypothesis, which was not generally accepted. I don't know if you can see all of this, but if you take a look, what he's saying is, because the language is a little bit different, that in this particular year, which is in 1784, he's giving his talk, and so he's talking probably about 1783. No, maybe 1784, it's hard to say. But he's saying there was a particularly cold winter that year. All right, the weather, the cold came early, and the snows remained, and it didn't melt. And why is that? And that's what the second point is here. He's saying, well, there was a lot of smoke in the air because there were these volcanoes in Iceland. Sounds familiar if you were traveling in Europe in the last summer, I guess. And he's suggesting that the volcanoes in Iceland were leading to the cold weather that occurred later that year in Europe. And that was a novel hypothesis. And it's one that might be true, it might not. You can sort of understand the logic of how it would happen, even though it's not intuitively obvious that it has to be that way. All right, but what happened a little while later is that there was this giant volcano that did occur. Now, it's after Franklin's time. It's 1815. That's not actually a picture of the volcano. Anyone taking a picture would be long dead. This is some nicer volcano where there's actually trees around it and whatnot. But that still looks pretty impressive. There was a big volcano in 1815. It was the biggest in the last 2,000 years. It does not happen very often. And here's an idea of how big this volcano was. Relative to a few others, there's Mount St. Helens, which is itty-bitty teensy-weensy down there. Here's Vesuvius, which is also itty-bitty teensy-weeny. And then there's a couple of more recent ones that, unless you're into volcanoes, you may not be that familiar with the names. This is the biggest one in the last 2,000 years. Oh, can you get rid of this? Great. I could have done that. I'm not thinking. Anyway, I'm not earning my money either. All right. So here's Tambora, and it's really big. All right. Now, the thing about this that's so good is Franklin has this hypothesis. The hypothesis is volcanoes cause cold weather, cold winters. All right. Well, to really get a test, you can do very careful scientific evidence, look at a lot of little volcanoes and see whether or not little changes in weather match up with them, but they're small changes. When you get a really big one, you should get a really big change. It should be much easier to measure because there's always a lot of background noise. And the difficult thing in conducting a lot of analysis is to get rid of the background noise. Controlled experiments get rid of it by the control. Economists try to get rid of the background noise to some extent by having a lot of data points and doing some statistical analysis that's somewhat fancy. But another way is to just sort of find a big cause and a big effect. If Franklin's right, we're going to have a cold winter. 1815. So here's this slide I found. When I was a kid, in fact, up until the first year in college, I was interested in the weather. I was a meteorology major when I went to college. That's what I thought I wanted to do. And one of the things I had remembered reading was this great year, the Year Without a Summer, it was called. And I would read it from time to time, and it sounded great because I liked bad weather. And this was a lot of bad weather. Now, this is a 1999 picture, and there's a little volcano, so someone already knows that the volcano has something to do with it. But in 1816, the year after the volcano, all right, you have snow in New York in June, ice in the water in Pennsylvania in the middle of the summer, crop failures throughout the northern hemisphere, the worst famine of the century. This is actually serious stuff. A lot of people died. And it wasn't just North America, it was also in Asia and Europe. And so this is pretty strong evidence that Franklin was right. You have this unique unique summer, really cold year. If there's any year they talk about for being really cold, this is it for the last several hundred years, and they didn't talk about it much before that, not in a written way, and it comes right after the volcano. To me, I would say that proves Franklin's point. Now, I'm not a volcano person. I didn't do enough reading about it to get a feel, but when I was reading about it, they think that volcanoes cause the temperature, as Franklin said, but they refer to it as a hypothesis, like they're not really completely sure, and I'm not sure how sure they are or aren't. But to me, it seems like you should be pretty sure. That was very convincing. It could have been a fluke that something else caused that cold year, but that's very unlikely. These are very unlikely events, and for one to occur after the other, as you might expect, exactly as Franklin predicted, that's really pretty overwhelming. And more overwhelming than any econometric studies that I ever read. All right? Particularly if you know how they're done. They're not usually overwhelming. All right, so the claim is that I'm making is, and that's something you don't hear very often, that if there's a very, very strong event and a very strong result that are both unlikely and unusual, then there's a very high likelihood they're going to be related. They may not be cause and effect, but they're likely to then have the same cause and both be effects. All right, and so that, I think, is something we can apply to sound recordings, and I am going to be not completely heretical in this. I'm going to talk about the economic studies as well. But first, let's talk about the simple examination. And what I'm suggesting is that essentially file sharing is to piracy what Tambora was to volcanoes. It was a very big, sudden increase in piracy, unlike anything we had seen before. That happened very quickly. Napster was the beginning of piracy in this type of form, and within a year it had 20 million people using it. Remember the head of Napster, the guy who invented it, Sean Fanning, was on the cover of Time magazine. This was a big deal, and lots of people were using it in a very short amount of time. And then the question is, what happened to record sales? What we're going to see is record sales had a very big decline, unlike any other declines that we have in the modern records. All right, and it's a logic that I actually think is a little easier to understand than the volcano hypothesis. I mean, the volcano, yes, it's putting soot in the air, and that might weaken the sunlight coming in, but you could have also argued, well, any sun that comes in then gets trapped, and maybe it's really going to be global warming or something instead of cooling. It's not that straightforward. There's going to be a version of that here as well, but the basic story is when you have a copy that is a virtually perfect substitute for an original, all right, why would you go out and buy the original? That seems to be pretty clear that there'll be people who won't buy the original after they have this very good substitute, and therefore there's every reason to think that if people are getting free copies, they're probably not buying as many originals. All right, so the theory, looking at it this way, you'd say, well, we should have a big decline in record sales. Right? Not something little, but we've had this big a decline, this big an increase in piracy, we should have a big decline in record sales. All right, so what happened to record sales in the U.S.? Here we have the line going up until the year 1999. You can see when Napster begins, oh, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, and it goes down. Here's where Greenspan is testifying. All right, so you see it's come down. Now, we had a really big recession in 1982, and we had another recession in 1980. The economy was really quite bad there, but that's the biggest decline in this period of time. Here's what happened since. All right, now, this is albums per person. All right, but a similar thing would, if we looked at revenues, we would have a similar result. And all I did here was to say, assume that we had the same growth rate after 1999 that we did before 1999. What would that have looked like? And that's the purple line, or the line at least with the purple markers. Here's what actually happened, and here's where Napster begins. The timing is just amazingly good. All right, the year after Napster takes off, or the year that Napster is taking off, is when record sales start going down. It's almost too good to be true. All right. And you don't expect it to necessarily be quite that close, but it's really perfect as a story.